Hi Year 6, I hope you're all okay. As you can see from your screen, my name's Mrs Southern and I'm part of the English department at King's, and I know I speak for all of us in the department when I say how excited we all are to be welcoming you in the near future, hopefully in September. But in the meantime, I'm really excited to be doing this session with you, which will hopefully give you an insight into what we study in English at King's, and a bit of a taster really. So on this slide, you can just see a brief overview of all the different topics that you study in Year 7. So there's 5 of them, which obviously relates to the number of learning cycles that we have within our routine at King's. So you can have a little scan over and see what we study. So really good variety, hopefully something there for everybody to enjoy. Hopefully builds on some of the things you've done at primary school, but also includes some new content things that maybe you haven't come across before. So for today's session, I've chosen to look at the history of English language with you, which is the LC2 focus. It's the unit we study in LC2. And I have done that deliberately rather than picking the Greek mythology unit from LC1. So there's a number of reasons why I really wanted to do this session with you guys today. So firstly, it's my favourite. So I have a real interest in English language. The history of English is something that I think is really fascinating. It's something that only stretches back years and years back in time. But because English is still changing constantly, it's never sort of static. It's something that's really topical. So we might look at things like words that have come in the last couple of years, and that makes it quite current and exciting. I also think it's a really challenging topic. So it's something that we focus on in A-level English, so in years 12 and year 13. So it's a real sort of bonus for you guys to get a bit of a taster of it when you're only in you will only be in year 7 when you start it properly. And then finally, I was saying before, our curriculum is a nice sort of mismatch of building on things that you've done before, but also new topics. And I'm hoping this one will be something that is quite new to you all. So on the next slide, you can see firstly the lesson hypothesis. So if you've done any of the other sessions for the other subjects, you'll be used to this by now. But we have a lesson hypothesis for all of our lessons at King's. So this is something that you'll be expected to write down. So if you're currently working electronically, something that you want to type, or if you are working on paper, just get this written down for me. So it's the English language was created by non-English people. So as you're jotting that down, you can also see there's some learning intentions. This is also quite a common feature of lessons at King's, just indicating 2 key things that I want to make sure that we cover, the knowledge that you'll have gained by the end of the lesson, things that you'll have learnt. So there's 2 of them. At the very bottom of the slide, you can see keywords. In many of our lessons, not just in English, you will be presented with certain keywords just to help with your expanding vocabulary, to make it really explicit what vocabulary we want you guys to be using within your written answers, verbal answers. And then lastly, you can see a do now. So all of our lessons start with a do now task, and today's do now is asking for prior knowledge. So with it being the first lesson within this scheme of work, it makes sense to kind of get a sense of what you guys already know already, if you know anything. So I've just arranged it into 2 bullet points. So the first one's probably the trickiest. So I've asked, do you have any idea what etymology might mean? You might not, that's fine. You might never have heard of it before. You might be able to have an educated guess. So jot something down there if you can. The second one, I think most of you will be able to have a good go at. So do you know of any invasions in our history that might have had an impact on our language? So I reckon from your studies in primary school, at some point you probably come across some well-known invasions. So if you just jot those down, put a little subheading do now, and get any of your ideas down. Just give you a little bit of a chance to do that, and then we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so etymology then. some of you might have had an idea already. Many of you might not have done though. So you've got what we call a VIF there. It's a very important fact. So you'll often see that acronym being used at King's. If you can just get this down also in your notes, whether handwritten or electronic, doesn't matter. But it's telling you what etymology means, what the definition of that word is. So it says it's the study of the origin of words, origin meaning where something comes from. And then it adds as well, if we investigate a word etymology, we will find out when it was first used, what language it came from, what it first meant, and then there's a ... there to represent that there might be further information you can learn when you look up the etymology of a word. They're the main ones. So again, I'll just give you a little bit of time to get that into your notes. Okay, so you can look up the etymology of pretty much any word. So I've started there with the etymology of the word etymology itself. So when I typed that in and when I investigated the etymology, this is kind of a brief version of what it came up with. So it told me that the origin of the word etymology is Greek. So it comes from the Greek language. The word etymos, might not have pronounced that quite right, but that's the root of it. And that means true. And this made quite a lot of sense when I thought about my understanding of the word etymology, because when we investigate the etymology of words, that is how we find the truth about them. We find out where they came from, what they first meant. Some words can be a bit ambiguous, they might be a bit misleading. We might assume we understand where they've come from, but actually we might be mistaken. So etymology means truth. An example of a word that has changed in meaning, so you might not be able to guess at its etymology, is this one. So the word awful. So obviously in our modern day, that word has quite a negative meaning. If something's awful, it's terrible. But actually the origin of this word is there on the screen, so you can see it actually was spelt differently, so it had an E in it, awful, and therefore meant awe-inspiring, which is actually a very positive thing. So we can associate it with the word awesome, and when we use the word awesome, that also has a very positive meaning. So somewhere along the line, the word awful has changed its meaning, and it's only by looking at the etymology that we can get the truth about what it first meant and where it came from. So what I'd like you guys to do is you're going to do a bit of investigation of your own. So you're going to look up the etymology of the 5 words that you can see on your screen. Now to do this, it's quite simple. All you need to do is to get onto Google and you can just type in etymology of government or whatever the word is. And then it will bring you up the information that we talked about before. So it might tell you the language in which it's come from, so Greek, for example. It'll possibly tell you when it was first used, so it might give you a century, so say the 12th century as an example. And it might also tell you if the meaning shifted. So what I'd like you to do in your notes, again, whether you're doing it handwritten or electronic, it doesn't matter. So I would just get 1 to 5 down in your margin, and then for each of those words, look it up and just jot down a couple of ideas. So in particular, the thing I'm most interested in is the language it's come from. So make sure, as best as you can, you found that for each of these words. I'm going to start a timer just to give you a bit of time to do your research and get your notes down. And then once that time's passed, we will confirm what the correct answers are. So off you go. Just approaching half of your time now. So hopefully you've made a good start on these 5. If you do find that you finish early, you can choose some words of your own to look up the etymology of. The more random, the more interesting. Now you just come up to your final minute. Last few seconds now, just to be finishing off your notes. Okay, so on this slide, you can see the languages which these 5 words have come from. So hopefully they fit with what you guys found. And the reason I focus particularly on the languages rather than when they were first used and so on is because this fits with our hypothesis. So our hypothesis was about the idea that English was formed from non-English speakers. So perhaps this slide and these answers suggest that that hypothesis is somewhat true, because we can see that that selection of those 5 words have all come from other countries, the influence of other languages, which is quite interesting. So another thing, again, still sticking with the idea of etymology, another thing that's quite interesting is that we can look up not just like objects or random words, but we can also look up names. And the etymology of names can be really interesting, especially when it's your own name. So you can see some information down the slide about the etymology of surnames and where they came from. So it tells us, for example, that up until around the 14th century, most people had only a first name, which is an idea that's quite strange to us. Obviously, we're used to having a first name and a surname. But then as the towns and cities grew, it became necessary to identify families. So that's when people started to be given a surname. And there are 4 main ways in which surnames were given. So you can see them on your slide. So patronymic is the first one. So you can see some examples there. So Peterson, that was implying who you were the son of, who your father was. We've got place names, so geographical features, that perhaps you lived nearby. So Hill, for example, that's quite a common surname today. Occupational names, which identified you by the job that you did. So Baker, again, still quite a popular name. And then lastly, nicknames. So again, you can see some examples for that one. Now, what I've done on the next slide is I've just investigated some of the surnames of staff within the English department. So you can see 3 of us there. So Mrs. Sharp, Mr. Brennan Wright, and then me there, Mrs. Southern. So before I reveal the etymology of our surnames, I'm just going to give you guys a chance to have a little think. Have you got any idea where these surnames might have come from? Which of those four sources of names on the previous slide do you think is most likely? Do you think they're likely to be patronymic, or maybe have come from an occupation? Have a little think. If you've got any ideas, you can jot them down, and then I'll reveal. Wonder if these staff actually know where their names have come from. Mrs. Sharp, I think, will be very pleased with hers. So Sharp originates from a medieval nickname. It's derived from the Old English word, I'm not going to try and pronounce that one, meaning sharp, which was used to describe a smart person. So yeah, I'm sure Mrs. is pretty happy with that as the etymology for her name. Mr. Bremner writes, I've looked at the word right. So this one is an occupational surname. You can see there it came from a word meaning worker or shaper of wood. So perhaps way back in history, people with the surname Wright would have had that sort of occupational job. And finally, my surname, so Southern, of Anglo-Saxon origin and comes from the word southern, which means, I should say man, so which means the man from the south originally. So presumably women would have had that surname as well. But society in the past would have been quite patriarchal, sort of men dominated, and therefore perhaps that's where the definitions come from. So what I'd like you guys to do now is have a little, again, investigation in terms of where your surnames come from. So again, you're going to do this in the same way. So you're just going to get onto Google and type in your surname. You might want to add the word surname into your search this time. So I think, for example, when I did mine, I put surname Southern etymology, just in case your surname happens to mean something else. So have a little look, and then again, jot your findings into your document that you're working in. I'm sure some of you will have some really fascinating origins in terms of where your surnames have come from. Maybe you can let your family know, let your parents know, quiz them, see if they already knew where their surnames come from. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to do that. If not, it's always something you can add to after the session. So I just wanted to return at this point to the hypothesis, just because that is what we are exploring over the course of the session. And perhaps, as I said before, perhaps we are starting to find that this hypothesis seems to be somewhat true. So some of your surnames, for example, might have come from foreign influences, other languages. Definitely a sense that English is a combination of lots of different influences. Now, the question I want to move on to just for the rest of this session is why there are so many foreign influences within the English language. You might have your own ideas. Links back to one of the other keywords from the start of the lesson. So one of the reasons, not the only reason, one of them is invasions. So as you probably know, England has been invaded many times by people from different countries, lots of different countries. And as such, they brought their language with them. And it wouldn't be the case that their language would completely overthrow the language that was already being used. But as people came into contact with each other, certain words would become part of the language. And then as it moved forwards, that's why we've got such a diverse language. It's full of different origins. So on the worksheet, which hopefully you guys have got access to, you can see a table, and within that table it gives you some examples of some of the invaders who have come to Britain. So you can see there, even on that little snapshot, we've got the Celts, the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons. Hopefully you've heard, I think there's one more at the bottom of your sheet, because this image is just a little snapshot. Hopefully you've heard of most of them, if not all of them. So what I'd like you to do is have a little read about each of them. And then in the final column, you can see some examples of place names that have come from those invaders. So the Celts, for example, you can see some of the place names that came from them, and so on. And hopefully you'll come across some that you never knew. And what you could do in your notes, in the document that you're working in, maybe just condense the table. So you could have a little subheading, the Celts. Try and just condense or cut down the information on the worksheet about the Celts, just so you've got maybe a sentence or a few ideas, and then transfer maybe one of the examples from the sheet into your document. And again, I'll just give you a few minutes to make a start on that at least. If you've not finished, by the time we move on to the next slide, again, it doesn't matter. It's something that you can do after the session's finished. Okay, I'm just going to move on to the next slide. I know you've probably not finished, but as I said, that's something that you can do, a bit of a takeaway task. This slide is just implying how complex the history of English is. So all of the invasions that were listed on that document that you've just started reading are from what we call the Old English period of English, and it gives you the dates there. But beyond that, there are other periods that the history of English is separated into. So we've got Middle English, Early Modern, and Modern English. And within each of those periods, there might be other invasions that have happened, or other significant events that might have shaped our language and made it change in some way. So what I'd like you guys to do as a takeaway task, just to add to any other bits that you've not had a chance to finish, I'd like you to have a little look in your own time at what might have influenced changes in the other periods. So we've just said Old English relates to the invasions on your sheet, but the other three we've not touched. So you can see them listed again there. So Middle English, Early Modern, and Modern English. Have a little investigation into these three periods. Were there any other notable invasions that happened that might have shifted language, or anything else. It might be inventions that have taken place, especially for modern English. Think about some of the social media that's been invented, for example, that might have affected the English language. And that's just a task for you to be getting on with, something to keep you occupied, that will give you a bit of a head start before you come to study this topic in LC2 of Year 7. So that's it then for me for now. Just to say again how glad I am that I've been able to do this session with you. I really hope it's given you a taster. Hope it's made you excited to come to King's and to start your learning experience with us. And I will look forward to seeing you whenever that time is, hopefully sooner rather than later. But in the meantime, take care everyone. Bye guys.